help pull together the panel of Christopher Bucca.
Okay, well, we've heard a lot about, we've heard a lot of descriptions of the problems that, Al-Qaeda and its affiliates have created in the last several years. This panel is going to be more directed at what can be, what really works in terms of counter-radicalization. And as you know, there are counter-radicalization programs in Saudi Arabia, which is obviously an efficient police state with a strong tribal structure, the kind of society where these programs can work fairly well. These programs, we'll also hear from Zach Abusa about what's going on in Southeast Asia. To me, this seems like the way forward. After all, I mean, if indeed it is Islam that's going to defeat Al-Qaeda, it is precisely the kinds of things that Saudi Arabia and the Indonesians, and to some degree the Yemenis perhaps, that is the way forward. I mean, in terms of a country which could really use this in particular is Pakistan. Pakistan obviously has the biggest radicalization problem imaginable, and either doesn't have the capacity or the to really do these counter-radicalization programs. I think it's very important for the Pakistanis to learn from some of the programs that we're going to hear about today. We have a really first-class panel to discuss this. Christopher Bucca, who is, along with Thomas Hegghammer, one of the leading experts on Saudi militancy. He has been doing the best work on the Saudi counter-radicalization program, whether that's through the clerics or whether that's through the internet. Chris is a Princeton postdoc, now at the Carnegie Endowment. On his right, Zach Abusa. Zach is, I think, without little debate, the leading scholar of militant Islam in Southeast Asia, which happens to be the title of one of his most recent books. Speaks a number of the languages of Southeast Asia. He has also been working on the counter-radicalization side, trying to investigate what's working there. And then finally we have Ken Baumann. Ken has been somebody who's looked at both the Saudi radicalization program and the Southeast Asian counter-radicalization program, but also, I think more importantly, Ken has done the best polling, I think, in the Muslim world about Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, attitudes. For instance, we heard earlier today about the poll after the Indonesian tsunami and the very quick turnaround in Indonesian attitudes towards the United States because of the US military help after the tsunami. Well, it was Ken who did that poll. Similarly, Ken went into Kashmir very soon after the earthquake there, and the US military help there, and did a snap poll. And his polling organization, unlike the larger organizations like Zogby or Gallup, I think has been much more nimble, and in fact, very importantly, did what seems to be the first independent poll ever in Saudi Arabia. So we've got a really first-class panel, and Christopher will go first.
Thank you very much. Peter, thank you for the invitation to be here today, and I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to be here to talk about the research that I've been doing. And I think the Saudi program, I think, is really important to study and kind of exciting to study because of several factors. And one is that the Saudis have spent the most money doing this. For the past 4 years, it's been the longest continually running program. And the government has given the Ministry of Interior, the people who administer this program, the blank check. And because of this, the Saudi program is becoming a de facto model for other countries on how to implement a similar type counter-radicalization program. And I think we'll talk about that more in the discussion. But as these programs spread and proliferate, you can definitely see that there's a genealogy to these. And you can see that what goes on in Saudi Arabia and what the Saudis have done echoes in many other places. So I think I'd like to start out by saying that most of what we either read in the newspaper or see on television about the Saudi program focuses on the money that the Saudis pay, the cars, the weddings, the financial material inducements that are given to former extremists. And while I don't want to downplay that, I think it's really important to pay attention to the psychological and emotional and intellectual counseling that goes along with this, all the intangible things. And hopefully through this 10-minute overview, some of those will come out. One of the important things to note about the way the Saudis look at this is that everyone is a victim. Everyone is a victim in terms of people who get recruited by extremists and radicals are victimized and tricked and abused and lied into joining a deviant organization. The government is a victim because it suffers from terrorism and violence. And the actual victims of terrorism are victims. So and this is very important, I think, to keep in mind that the way that the Saudis have been able to do this, everybody suffers. And in doing this, the government is able to call upon a lot of resources to address these needs. I think a few things to keep in mind is that this program is primarily deals with the prevention of recidivism. So it's taking people through this program, security offenders in the kingdom, and making sure that they don't reoffend. An important side to that is that it also is tailored to making sure that you short-circuit the radicalization process within people's families and social associations. So I think I should say right off the bat, this program is geared for security offenders, domestic security offenders in Saudi Arabia. There's a similar program for guys that either get caught going to Iraq or people who come back from Iraq. And there's also a program to deal with people who are repatriated from Guantanamo. The Guantanamo program is a little bit different than the other two, but mostly they're pretty similar. The way this works is that people are invited to participate. People in Saudi prisons are invited. You have the option to participate. You can't be released from prison through this program if you have blood on your hands. So if you've committed a terrorist act inside the kingdom, you can't get out of jail through doing this. Similarly, if you've been convicted of a crime, for those that have actually gone before a judge, can't be released until you've served out all the time on your sentence. And there's a last stipulation, which is even for those people who finish the program, finishing doesn't mean you'll be released. You need to prove to the government that you won't get into trouble again. So if they have reason to believe that letting you out of jail is going to lead to more violence or more radicalization, they just don't let you out. And there are a couple of concerns that arise out of this. One is that there's a real concern about due process. There are a number of people estimated to be about 3,200 under detention in Saudi Arabia. A number of these have never gone before a judge. The Saudi government is trying to figure out a way to create a security-type court to handle these cases. Furthermore, it's very difficult to get an idea of metrics and how you're going to measure the success of this program. We can talk about the figures of who's been released and recidivist rates, but it's an incredibly opaque program that you're looking at. The rehabilitation part is the middle part of a three-part strategy for how the Saudi government views it's going to combat terrorism. And this is, in English, it's called the PRAC strategy. So there are programs, prevention programs, to combat people getting involved with radicals and extremists. There is rehabilitation programs to deal with you once you are in the state's care, once you're in prison. And then there are aftercare or reintegration programs to help you reintegrate into Saudi society. And I think it's kind of important to keep in mind that this isn't a brand new idea in Saudi Arabia. The idea of having religious figures go into Saudi prisons to deal with prisoners, this has gone on for a while. Religious scholars or imams would go visit people in prison and ask how you got there. I mean, it's kind of a tradition in the kingdom. Furthermore, religious figures used to be used in police interrogations in the kingdom, so kind of to intellectually interrogate people, kind of encourage you to confess and get right with God. So the way this works is that there's an organization called the Advisory Committee, which is underneath the Ministry of Interior. The Advisory Committee has offices throughout the kingdom, 7 different offices. And it's made up of a number of different components. The one that we'll talk about today is made up of religious figures, about 150 religious scholars and university professors. And these are the people who actually go out and engage with prisoners, who sit down and talk to them. And the idea is that through dialogue, one-on-one discussion, they ask you, how did you manage to get in prison? What were your beliefs that got you here? And then they try to demonstrate that those beliefs were based on an incorrect understanding of Islam. I think kind of in a big picture, this program is based on the idea of benevolence. It's not based on punishment or retribution or vengeance. It says to the individual prisoner or the prisoner's family, we understand how you could have gotten in this situation, and we want to help you come back to the right way. It's a very Saudi-specific solution to a Saudi problem. It uses lots of traditional methods of conflict resolution and conflict management. It's a lot about co-optation, about coercion, about persuasion. And you can see this throughout the history of the kingdom. You can see similar type things being done about drawing people in. There's an important other part, which is that this program also works sort of as good propaganda. I mean, it goes against the ideas that you're going to be abused or tortured or raped in prison. It goes to encourage other people to take part in prison amnesty programs, things like that. So there are two ways this works. Either there's a 2-hour session where you sit down with a sheikh, and at the end of your 2 hours, or maybe 2 or 3 times you do that, you recognize that you've seen the light and you don't want to do this anymore. This is usually for people who are looking for a way out, people who got caught up with extremists and are not very ideologically committed. There's also something called long study sessions, and these are a series of classes that detainees go through. So it's 6 weeks, about 20 students, and you take 10 or so classes. At the end of the session, you take an exam. If you fail the exam, you repeat the course. The courses are administered by religious scholars and social scientists, so psychologists, social workers, counselors, things like that. And in addition to treating someone when you're in prison or in one of these halfway type centers, which I'm sure some of you have seen on television, the Saudi government also provides extensive social support to people's families. So if you're in custody, you're no longer earning a salary, the government steps in to provide a stipend. They will take care of getting your kids to school, your parents to the hospital, trying to offset the hardships associated with your incarceration. This continues once you leave the program. And a lot of the thinking behind this, I think, it kind of be geared at looking at moving people out of that age in their lives when they are most willing to do this. So you leave prison, they'll encourage you to get married, encourage you to have kids, encourage you to get a job, get you busy with lots of other things so you're not getting into trouble the same way. When we talk about how this works, in addition to treating someone's extended social network, which is key, they also say upon release to your extended family and tribe that you're responsible for this person. So if a detainee gets released and gets into trouble, the government says, we're coming back to you because you're responsible. In doing this and spreading the responsibility across lots of different shoulders, it's extremely effective. So thus far, about 3,000 people have gone through this program in the kingdom. Of that, about 1,400 have been released. Of those 1,400, about 35 have been rearrested on security offenses. So that gets to be about 1 or 2% recidivist rate thus far. So those are people who have been rearrested on security offenses in the kingdom. For the Guantanamo returnees, there are about 120, I think, who have been returned. 50 or so, I think, have been released, and of those, I don't think any have been rearrested on security offenses. Maybe 2, but I think that's still in dispute. I think the last thing they'll talk about is there's a similar program on the internet called the Sakina Campaign. Sakina is an Arabic word which refers to the tranquility one gets, the peace through God. And this is a program where religious scholars go online and interact with people in web forums, and they do the same thing, ask you why you were thinking what you're doing and try to steer you towards the right path. One of the really interesting things about this program is that after the back and forth dialogue, this dialogue is posted online for other people to read. And one of the interesting things, and one of the kind of important things to keep in mind when you're talking about counter-radicalization, is that in addition to taking away a negative, you need to give people a positive. So if people are going online to look for religious inspiration or looking for answers to religious questions, you also need to give people a way to get positive answers to that. I think I'll probably stop there so we can have lots of time to talk and let my other panelists get to it. Thank you very much.
Zachary Abusa.
I'd like to thank Peter and the New America Foundation for inviting me today. It's a great honor to be here and share the stage with so many analysts and authors and scholars whom I respect and I study, and my students have just grown to hate. I'm going to be talking about disengagement programs in Southeast Asia, in particular Indonesia, but also the cases in Singapore and Malaysia, which are slightly more similar. We use the term disengagement, not de-radicalization, because as Lawrence Wright was saying this morning, what we're really trying to do is get, if you envision different concentric circles, with the tightest in the center being that jihadist action and active violence, simply trying to get people to renounce violence. And that's really the heart of the programs in Southeast Asia. These people are still committed Islamists, to be sure, but simply trying to get them to renounce violence. The study I've done, which is actually in a forthcoming book with Chris that should be out sometime soon, is a comparative study around the world of these programs. And there are a lot more places that need to be studied, and I hope people continue this work. What I did in my study is I really looked empirically, because the governments of Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia were not giving any of this information out. This is stuff they were keeping very close to their chest. And so I would basically go around and compile data on all the people that had been arrested for terrorist activities. And I would go to human rights organizations, anti-Internal Security Act organizations. I would get a whole, every bit of data and information on people who had been arrested. And I kept a database about when people were released and could try to look at it empirically. In Indonesia, we've had over 300 arrests of members of Jemaah Islamiyah. There have been about 125 plus convictions, but very short sentences in Indonesia, something that probably drives the American and Australian governments mad. But these have been very, very low levels. Just to give you a sense, the Bali bombing in October 2002, the most lethal terrorist attack after 9/11, 12 of the 33 bombing suspects have already been set free. So again, that's something. I think this is, in Indonesia, they claim 10 to 20 members of JI have been rehabilitated really successfully in this program that they rely on. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. In Singapore, the numbers we're talking about are around 73 people detained between October 2001 and January 2008. They are detained under the Internal Security Act. Around 18 of those people were released conditionally fairly quickly, so we have 55 who were placed under longer term, detained for a longer term. The Singaporeans quickly put together a group of volunteer clerics called the Religious Rehabilitation Group that was modeled on the Yemeni Theological Dialogue. By January 2008, 18 of those 55, or 33%, had been placed on, had been released conditionally. And there are many different levels, and my data, it's too complicated to explain in such a brief period of time, so I'm conflating some of the data here. But in total, 60% of all the people the Singaporean government has arrested since 2001 have been released conditionally or unconditionally. And that's in a country that takes its security very seriously. Average sentences there have been 51 months, 5 served for over 72 months. And of course, there are hard cases that I'll get back to. In Malaysia, we're talking about 115 arrested, more or less, including 2 women. Like Singapore, Malaysia has detention without trial based on an old colonial-era Internal Security Act. 33% of those people, or 33 or 29%, have been unconditionally released, and to date, 65% have been conditionally or unconditionally released. So, with the exception of one cell that really skews my data, and if I remove that, the average term for those people is between 4 to 5 years. So again, we're in both Singapore and Malaysia, we're looking at about a 4-year sentence that people serve before they are released on this program. As Chris mentioned, people are invited into this process. You do not have to go through it. Let me just mention a couple key points about each of these models. In Indonesia, what's very salient there is that they have relied on members of Jemaah Islamiyah to do the de-radicalization or disengagement process themselves. And they've taken advantage of the fact that Indonesian society is quite hierarchical and there's a lot of deference to authority. The poster child to this was a very senior member of Al-Qaeda who was just repulsed by the Bali bombing. He had been in Afghanistan, he knew what it was to wage jihad, and the targeting of innocent civilians was not jihad in his point of view. And he turned state's witness, and he has been very cooperative in this. He is the poster child for this. His name is Nasir bin Abbas, but the Indonesian program has a lot of limitations. It's very ad hoc. We keep on talking about the Indonesian program. It's not a program. It's just not that developed. They have very limited resources. Police were just called into becoming social workers. They weren't trained for it. They have limited personnel for this. Since 2007, the Indonesian government has been working more closely with the families and providing some funds for the families so that they do not rely on JI's social networks. That's very important. And the last thing I want to note about the Indonesian program is I think that when we look at who's come out of this successfully, I think it's a lot more heartfelt because you don't have to go through this program to get out of jail. The jail sentences have been so light there. You could just refuse to attend and you're going to get out of jail. They have annual remissions, amnesties every year, so that's something to consider. Now in Malaysia and Singapore, their campaign against terrorism has been fought using the ISA, the Internal Security Act that allows indefinite detention, which is a bit more of a deterrent. Now, these two countries have invested a lot more money into the program. They're much more thought out and thorough programs. They involve clerics, theologians, sociologists, parole officers, social workers that meet with families, etc. They really have put in a lot of resources in this. I don't think they've put in some of the material rewards that they have in Saudi Arabia, taking care of marriages, but they have helped try to get people jobs afterwards. In one case in Malaysia, they gave the wife of a senior terrorist operative money so that when she was released, so she could start up a company. So there is a lot more of that. They're also working with families. The Singaporeans especially have really tried to go out and have as many counseling sessions, not just with the members of JI who have been detained, but with their family members. And I think this is, they know that the families are really probably the strongest influence in this. And the last thing that I want to say about Singapore and Malaysia is that we have to understand the context, that these are fairly small countries, the numbers of detainees are quite small, and their security systems are very robust. They can keep very thorough tabs on these people when they have been released, which is probably not as true in Indonesia. I just want to conclude my final time with 10 points or takeaways that I've kind of garnered from studying these programs. The first is that this is a slow process. Again, we're looking 4 to 5 years for most of the people that are going to come out of this. It requires a lot of resources. States, if they're going to do this, have to be committed to putting together a very thorough program that, again, includes not just clerics and having a theological dialogue. It's got to include a battery of psychologists, sociologists, parole officers. It's got to be coupled with prison reform, the whole works. The second is roots versus roots. Are you born into JI? Because if you study this organizations, it's so interconnected through family ties. The familial kinship networks are very, very dense. And I think we need to study more whether that is an inhibition to going through this program, rather than if you were simply recruited into this through coming out of a conflict zone, or you were recruited through a madrasa or something like that. That still needs a lot more study. The third point is the closer you are to a terrorist attack, the less likely you are to be rehabilitated. The most, if you look at the people who have been released in Singapore or Malaysia, for the most part they were financiers, they were supporters, they were logisticians, they were not the actual terrorists, not engaged in blowing things up. Even in Indonesia, you have few cases of people that were actually involved with violence who have really renounced it. And I can think of one clear example, Ali Imran. Two of his brothers are on death row for the Bali bombings, but he has come out, he's written about it, he's denounced this, he's tried to repudiate their ideology. But for the most part, again, it's the closer you are to the terrorist act, the less likely you are to be rehabilitated. There are successes, but there are some real hard cases, and the Malaysian and Singapore and Indonesian governments all like to trumpet their successes, but there are still a very large number of people that have not been rehabilitated. And I think you can kind of look at the case. There was one person that this caused a lot of egg on the face of the Singapore government, escaped from their prison, and my guess is if he was very close to being rehabilitated and had renounced jihadi violence, you wouldn't risk everything by breaking out of a Singaporean prison. So again, there's that. There's been very little voluntary disengagement. Very few individuals have just come out and quit JI and spoken about it if they have. The fifth point is that in Singapore and Malaysia, they've relied on what I would call state clerics, religious leaders that have close ties to this state. And I think that could discredit them over time, or simply could pose challenges. And maybe they're relying on people that might not have the most religious authority, but people that are trusted the most. Again, sixth point, I can't emphasize the importance of having relations when you're doing this, working with the wives and families. You might have to support them. You might have to give them an allowance so that they are not going to turn back to terrorist social networks. The seventh point, societal norms in Malaysia and Indonesia in particular are really changing. Islamist parties and civil society organizations are very robust and provide ample opportunities to engage in Islamist nonviolence discourse. There's Islamist media. In Indonesia, mere membership in Jemaah Islamiyah is not illegal. So there are opportunities. Again, this is the opportunity to get these people to be weaned off violence. 8, Singapore has now arrested 5 homegrown militants. And again, you can take this for what it's worth. They don't provide a lot of information on this. These are people that were not members of JI, who were radicalized online. They wanted to make their way to Pakistan, to Afghanistan. I don't think anyone knows so far how well homegrown militants are going to be de-radicalized. I put this out there because we're seeing so much more homegrown in Europe. And the 9th point I just want to say about the Internal Security Act, this is indefinite detention, and this could be a deterrent itself, that if Singapore and Malaysia had a legal process where people would have their day in court, they might have very different results. This is the one way people have a chance they have to see the light of day. And the 10th point I would make in all 3 countries is we have had cases of recidivism. So this is not a perfect program, but I think it's something. They're trying to do something positive, and it should, we should study it more and hope other countries emulate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zach. And now we'll have Ken Baumann.
Thank you, Peter. Really appreciate your invitation, and New America and NYU for hosting this event here today, which I think we can all agree has been quite illuminating. I have, first of all, I'd like to start out by saying context for de-radicalization and counter-radicalization is everything. And you'll see what I mean as I go through my talk. I'm going to make 4 points to you. Number 1, the first point I would like to say is the Saudi program is commendable. I think we can all agree that these kinds of efforts are in the right direction. The most important point, though, that you should remember about the Saudi program is that it's happening at all. In Saudi Arabia today, they are leading a program of de-radicalization and counter-radicalization, putting significant resources into it. More than that, what they do is on the media. People who are successful graduates of this program appear on the media. They go into mosques. These are people who once were associated with the radicals are now going back to the communities with the support of the Saudi government, but saying how this has led them astray. So this could have a ripple effect throughout the entire society, and this tells us most of all that the Saudis are serious about a counter-radicalization program. And I think, as Zach pointed out, in Indonesia they have a program, but it's quite ad hoc. And another important point that the Saudis can do is act as a role model for other nations that have less in the way of resources, less in the way of experience in doing this. The Saudi program is comprehensive, systematic, religiously based. That kind of approach for other countries, the Saudis aiding that, could be one of the best legacies they could do in furthering this program. And that was the one, spending a while in Saudi Arabia, that was the one suggestion that I had to them, is that they should reach out to other Muslim nations that are seeking to do these kinds of programs. The second point I'd like to make is while the Saudi program is certainly commendable, it is way too early to talk about it being successful in terms of actually rehabilitating known terrorists and extremists. First, is this program so unique? Well, it's not unique to me. As a federal prosecutor, I had about 60 people who went into our federal witness protection program. The United States has had this program now for 4 decades. We take people who are criminals, essentially. It's called witnesses, but they're criminals. They testify against other criminals. Over 8,000 people have gone into our program, 10,000 family members. We've been doing this for 40 years. So we have, and they get psychological counseling. They get even more than they get in Saudi Arabia. They get a whole new identity. So this is something that we have a lot of experience with in the United States. And it's very interesting for me to read the media accounts criticizing the Saudi program because, on average, $30,000 to $40,000 is about what they get when they leave the program, people to start their new lives, get married, get a job, etc. Well, our average in the witness protection program is about $60,000. So we're actually paying people a lot more than the Saudis are. So not a very good criticism, really. We've talked about, the Saudis have said they've had success with the program because the recidivism rate is low. Well, 1% to 2%, as Chris pointed out. And by the way, Chris, I'll give you a plug. He wrote a paper on this which goes into great detail, and is an excellent paper at the Carnegie. Anyway, and the Saudi numbers are set forth in the paper, 1% to 2%. Wow, that sounds great, only 1% to 2%. Well, I don't know. Here in the United States, we've studied recidivism for a long time. Our rates are about 67%. That means 2 out of 3 people within 3 years of being released from state prison reoffend. You know, in the witness protection program, you have a very great incentive not to go back to your life in crime. And you know what that incentive is? You're going to get killed. That's what happens to you if you go back. We're talking about mafia people, Colombian cartel. These are not nice people. You go back, commit a life of crime, you're gone. You know what the rate of recidivism in the witness protection program is? 17%. That means 17, and they often get killed. You can read about it, they go back and they get killed. But 17% drop out of the program and go back to their former life of crime. So when you're talking about 1% to 2%, what that tells me is that the people you're releasing are not hardcore criminals or terrorists, because we know that they reoffend. And indeed, the Saudis have said that most of the people, or all of the people being released are kind of on the fringes, or minor offenses or minor offenders. And you know, we really don't. That is the one group that prison does deter, by the way. People are not hardened criminals. Because who wants to be, if any of you guys, you're laughing, that's actually true. Because you don't want to go to, if you're you know, a law-abiding person, don't have a life of crime, the worst place to be is in prison. So when you take Saudi people who are, you know, kind of sympathetic to the radical cause but not hardcore terrorists or criminals, and put them and confine them, it may be that that's deterring them from going back, the confinement, and not the rehabilitation process. The problem is there's no independent statistics or no independent data that we can really know what is deterring these people from going back to committing terrorist acts again, or in these cases, they're really not committing terrorist acts. All right. I guess I've got some slides, which is, to go to my third point, is how can a program like this be successful? Well, okay, there we go. Well, we've seen a big change in Saudi Arabia. We've seen opinion in the United States, the unfavorable opinion drop. We did a public opinion poll, as Peter pointed out there, recently, and we did a more limited one before that. We see major shifts in Saudi opinion. Bin Laden, support for Bin Laden has plummeted from nearly half the Saudis thinking of him favorably in 2003. It's now down to 15%. And even more significantly than that, what does it mean to say you're a Bin Laden supporter? Well, not a whole lot. Because if we look at the views of Saudis, whether they're Bin Laden supporters or not, they are against terrorism. They are, in fact, Bin Laden, 95% of Bin Laden said the most important priority for the government of Saudi Arabia is to go after terrorism. That is why a de-radicalization or counter-radicalization program can work, because you have the popular support behind it. It occurs in a context. It does not occur without a context. Which brings me to, I think, the headline of the day. Well, not yet. A subtext of the day. Look, what would improve opinion in the United States and Saudi Arabia? It's the same policies if the United States adopts whether or not people support Bin Laden. If we withdraw our forces from Iraq, people in Saudi Arabia want that. If we increase the number of visas, whether you're a Bin Laden supporter or not, that's an overwhelming 3/4 of the people want it. Free trade, they want that. Military aid, slightly less, but they want that. What they do not want, most of all, is the United States spreading democracy in the Middle East, which they don't see as democracy. Okay, now to the headline. Pakistan. Would such a de-radicalization program work in Pakistan? Well, at the moment, I don't think it will. There is significant, a panelist said 80%, and I may have heard it wrong, Pakistanis think well of al-Qaeda. That's not true. You can see the numbers there, about a third think well, and that's up a little bit. But what's interesting about it is that the top goal that people, Pakistanis, feel that Bin Laden and al-Qaeda represent is that they stand up to America. And Pakistanis overwhelmingly agree with that top goal. In fact, Pakistanis consider, and this is a poll just from a couple of months ago, that the violence occurring in Pakistan today, it's the responsibility of the United States. It's not al-Qaeda, or it's not the Pakistani Taliban. You can barely see them on that chart. Forget about this being a small screen in the room. You can't even see the number of people that blame those forces for that, what's going on. They blame the United States. Their personal fear of their own safety, they think it's the United States, followed well behind by India, and in little tiny single digits there are the al-Qaeda and Afghan Taliban, and whomever, Pakistani Taliban. But there is some good news in this, which again, it's about American policies. That is driving a lot of the dissatisfaction. If we have different policies, such as the disaster aid, Peter mentioned we did a poll after the earthquake, and you saw dramatically different numbers in Pakistan, and people still feel that way. They want aid. Whether you're a Bin Laden supporter, whether you're an al-Qaeda supporter, or you don't like them, the same kind of policies for most people would make a difference. So this support for Bin Laden and al-Qaeda is quite soft, unless you go into even in the Northwest Frontier Province itself, and visas and trade and what have you, and you can look at those results on our website. So what does this mean? It means for de-radicalization, people ask, well, what's the American role in this? Well, the American role has to do with American policies and setting the context for these kinds of programs to succeed. That's the American role. And changes in policies do make a difference. All right, let me sum up by saying, concluding, what does this all mean? Well, these programs, the most important effect of these programs is the message they can send to society at large. The Saudis When I was over there, every night on TV there was a different program. I don't know how many people are watching it. They're probably watching some of the soap operas from Lebanon. But there was always a program on interviewing former radicals and talking about it, or how did you get involved and all of that. This is very important, and it's important they go into the schools. It's important they go on the mosques. Because really the bottom line to de-radicalization, it's a lot easier to stop someone from joining the radical cause than to dissuade them once they're in it. That needs to be the key ingredient behind de-radicalization, because frankly, once they're in, and the deeper they're in, the harder it is to get them out. The more they're on, as Zach pointed this out, the more they're on the fringes of it, the less involved, the less committed to the terrorist acts, the less they've done, the easier it is to get them out, and the more they've done, they don't tend to change their point of view, with a couple of notable exceptions. And also, as in Saudi Arabia, they're simply not released, and for good reason. So I think these are important developments. They say something very important about what is happening in Saudi Arabia and what is happening around the Muslim world today, and how the United States can support that with our policies in the context in which they're occurring. Those are the most important lessons. The actual success inside these programs still remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. You know, it is a sort of self-evident that one of the reasons we're in this room is because of radicalization that happened in prison. I mean, Qutb's radicalization in Egypt, Zawahiri's radicalization in prison in Egypt, Zarqawi's radicalization in the Jordanian prison. You know, we know what followed after those radicalizations. So clearly, getting these prison de-radicalization programs right is incredibly important, arguably the most important thing we can do collectively as a civilized group of nations. And I think a lot of people might be surprised that one of the leaders in this effort is the US military. At Camp Bucca in Iraq, where we're detaining thousands of Iraqis, exactly the same programs that you've heard about that have been going on in Saudi Arabia and Indonesia, the US military is now importing into Camp Bucca, because they realize they can't just keep arresting people. They've got to move them out of the prison, try and de-radicalize them. And I was going to ask Christopher, is there a compare and contrast with the experience in Saudi Arabia and the experience in Iraq? Obviously, Iraq is kind of a semi-failed state, unlike Saudi Arabia, which is a very strong police state with a great deal of resources. To what extent has, I think if General Doug Stone was here, who implemented the program initially, he would say the recidivism rate in Iraq is incredibly low. But I wanted to draw you out, Christopher, to see what are the comparisons and contrasts between Iraq and Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. I think without having done any kind of research in Iraq on what the military is doing, I think one of the things that makes the Saudi program very successful is that they're able to choose which scholar they'll have dialogue with which prisoner. That there's such a huge pool of scholars and religious officials, they can tailor it to make sure that that works. One of the things that I would be really interested to find out is who is it that the military or the Iraqi officials who actually run this, who is it that they choose to dialogue with these guys? What kind of legitimacy is there? And I think one of the things that makes the Saudi program effective is that it's not necessarily government stooges who are sitting down and talking to these guys. It's former radical religious figures that were involved in the original radicalization process for these guys. So it actually has some resonance. So it's someone you want to sit down and talk with. So I don't know quite how that's going to work with what Task Force 134 does.
Questions? Mike Croft.
Thanks very much. Mike Kraft, former counterterrorism officer at State. I had a question about the Saudi program. You described the amount of money involved with for the participants. I heard another presentation from some Brits who looked into the program. One of their observations is some of the real hardcore terrorists have been killed in shootouts, so you're dealing with more of the support groups. But more to the point, do you think a program like this would work in countries like Turkey and Sri Lanka, where the main terrorist groups are partly motivated by, shall we say, regional or ethnic conflicts, and also for countries in North Africa like say, Morocco and Algeria, where they don't have the financial resources, do you think it could be adapted? Thank you.
I think I got it. Thanks. The financial resources are essential to make a program like this successful, and that's why I talked about the Federal Witness Protection Program in the United States and how much we spend. It's obviously a program with a different purpose, which is to get people's testimony, but the idea of trying to not send people or not keep people in prison and to rehabilitate them and get them to reform their ways is similar, and I think without the financial resources to help people get started with their new lives, particularly when many radical organizations, like as Zach mentioned in Indonesia, if the government doesn't help people, then the JI, the radical organization, will come in and help them. So I think the resources are essential, and I think that's a role that Saudi Arabia could play around the world in a very constructive way, which is help other countries set up these programs, and as Chris points out, some of the religious scholars, they can lend those to some of the other nations, and so I think the resources are kind of a sine qua non to making a program like this work. I don't think you can do it unless you're willing to put some money into it and have it.
Yeah.
I have mixed feelings about some of this with insurgencies versus a terrorist organization. In the case of the Tamil Tigers, the Tamil Tigers have killed probably more moderate Tamils than they have Sinhalese. If you think they'll go out and systematically target any Tamil politician. And so part of me says, yes, there's an opportunity there for Tamils to pursue nonviolent political alternatives. That's why that engages the wrath. So that's something the Sri Lankan government probably should pursue, but doesn't. They also commit a lot of human rights abuses in their counterinsurgency campaign. But one of the things that makes rehabilitation programs of this more difficult in insurgencies is that when you capture these people, the families still might live in those communities. That's very different. Could you imagine what the Tamil Tigers would do to a family of a Tamil Tiger who became a poster child for the government and went through this program? So I think we have to think that these insurgent groups do control territory. They are often states unto themselves.
Comment, by the way, I mean, one of the most successful things we're doing in Afghanistan is the amnesty program for the Taliban. There isn't a reconciliation, there isn't a de-radicalization part of this, but you get released from jail, you get released back to your community, you say that you will fight the government, and that's it. And because it's a tribal society, just like Saudi Arabia is, the recidivism rate has been incredibly low, according to both Afghan and US government officials. So there are different gradations here. I mean, amnesty may be kind of more useful in an insurgency, perhaps, than de-radicalization. Christina Asquith.
Thank you. I'm Christina Asquith. I'm writing a book about women in Iraq. My question is there also embedded in the de-radicalization message an argument against committing acts against Westerners, or is it just an argument against Muslims killing Muslims? And the second question I have is, do you have any evidence that the Saudi Arabian government is also making efforts to combat terrorism overseas? Overseas meaning outside of Saudi Arabia, in London and the US.
Right. Thank you. I think it's important to keep in mind that the Saudi program is geared towards Saudi Arabia. It's not meant to address what goes on in Israel and Palestine. It's not meant to address what goes on in Iraq. It's about what's legitimate and authorized and permissible to do inside the state of Saudi Arabia. And they don't even talk about whether or not you would be legitimate in doing these things fighting abroad. They just talk about how it's not authorized and it's not legal, and they go through the reasons why you can't go, right? But they don't get into the idea of whether or not it's a sympathetic idea or things like that. And I think, really clearly, I think this was said earlier today, that the Saudis wouldn't have been doing this if they weren't extremely concerned about the security and stability of the state. They would not have mobilized as much of the state apparatus as they have if they didn't have major concerns. And it's very kind of interesting that a lot of the tenets of Wahhabism about loyalty and obedience and recognition of authority get stressed in this program, and it actually kind of, I think, has a lot of power with these guys because it's talking to them about what can you do and what can't you do. So it's a very kind of Saudi solution. So I wouldn't want to talk about this in terms of how the Saudi government uses this abroad. I mean, they do go abroad. They do talk to lots of other people who create these programs. I mean, I think the Saudis have been pretty active in trying to support and generate some of these programs abroad. So.
Chris, I think it's very important to point out that when the Saudis, I mean, they have a particular language when they're talking about this, which I think is quite smart, and they talk about deviancy. Yeah. And they also talk about takfiri, basically these groups are arrogating to themselves the ability to decide who is a Muslim and who isn't. And obviously that's really heretical in a sense because at the end of the day, only God can do this. So I think, Ken has mentioned this sort of public diplomacy thing that the Saudis have been doing with this program. But I think it's very important that the language that they're using is very smart. And you mentioned the way that they treat everybody as a victim rather than a criminal. So I think they thought it through fairly carefully. But it is a Saudi solution for a Saudi problem. It may not be exportable in the same way.
I mean, I think there's a great example to be seen in how if the government stops someone from going to Iraq, when the government informs that family, instead of calling up and saying, your son was stopped and he's going to spend 12 months in jail and X, Y, and Z and you're in trouble. Instead they say, congratulations, we saved your son from going off to Iraq and getting hurt or hurting other people. And it completely changes the dynamic with how the state interacts with the family. And it sets them off to a much better trajectory.
And that's an important point because they do, it's not just against terrorism inside the kingdom. They do people who have even gone to Iraq or come back or been caught from going to Iraq. So there is that foreign policy dimension. They say that is not an authorized activity.
Suzanne Spaulding.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to the subtitle of today's program and the phrase in quotes, the war on terror. And I know Steve mentioned it this morning, and there seems to be a growing consensus that we've paid a very high price for choosing the political and legal framework of the global war on terror. But I want to get your views on the next step, which is evaluating and bringing some real granularity to a cost-benefit analysis of explicitly renouncing, rejecting the global war on terror. And again, there are costs to doing that. There are lots of costs in terms of the U.S. dynamic inside the U.S., a premature declaration of mission accomplished, perception of that, a potential complacency, etc. There are also some clear benefits in terms of inside the United States and that dynamic, clear benefits in terms of cooperation with allies. But from your perspective, from a radicalization, de-radicalization, views within the Muslim world, for example, are the benefits of expressly renouncing the global war on terrorism, do you have a sense of the significance of those benefits and whether they outweigh the potential costs?
Ken,
Well, there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever from our polling data and the polling data of everybody else who's looked at this issue that the vast majority of Muslims, indeed it's a consensus point of view, see the war on terror, the American-led global war on terror, as a war against Islam and a war against Muslims. There is absolutely no doubt that that's how it's perceived. So I think it would behoove us to come up with different ways of trying to express how we feel about what is a clear problem with al-Qaeda and the rise of extremism.
Guys, do you want to add?
I think the way the Saudis look at this is about a war of ideas. And I think some of the things that they've tried to bring to this is this whole series of prevention programs geared at how can you deter people from going off down that path. And I think the fact that the Saudis aren't just looking at this as the purely with kinetic ideas in mind, that it's not just about killing and capturing people. I mean, it's about this whole strategy is looking at where do we want our society to be 25 or 35 years down the road, and how do we implement these things today to get there. So I think all these things that we've been talking about today, rule of law and putting these things in a legal framework also help.
Thank you. Raja Gundu from Georgetown. One strategy that's often used to deter, further radicalization is when a terror suspect is captured, his family is focused on, and there's a lot of limelight on them. And this strategy would say that this deters, and because of the shame faced by the family, no other youth would take to terrorism. On the other hand, the moment the family denies that our son was not involved in radicalism, and the moment it seems as if the state has arrested an innocent suspect, or so the community starts believing, this actually creates more radicals, because of a sense of victimization that happens. So what should be the right strategy?
I didn't get that question. Do you? Anybody? Okay, we don't seem to have an answer to that.
Paula Gordon, GordonHomeland.com. There was a study done a few years ago, a survey of interviews with extremists, asking them why there had not been an attack, another attack. And this was several years after 9/11. I don't have full details of it, except I do know remember the two things that were found. And one was that it had to do in part with the rapidity of the reaction of the United States in the attack on Afghanistan, and the other was the surprise by the actions of the citizens, of the passengers on board the flight that went down in Pennsylvania. I've also heard more recently—
What's the question? Sorry.
Well, I'm just asking if they know about this research or other research looking into asking extremists why there had not been further attacks.
Okay, I think that's a no from the panel. Any other questions? In back.
Yes, I'm Miranda Scobie from the University of Utah, and I was just wondering if there are areas where a program such as the Saudi model for disengagement does not exist, especially in the Middle East or the greater Middle East, if there's a place where it may be needed that actually doesn't have one.
Yeah, I think we both said Pakistan.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
Sir.
I'm Brock Renshaw with Special Operations Command. Got a question regarding the Saudi program and also the Southeast Asia programs. What is the popular support viewed with these programs? Does the populace that is not have family members who are extremists, are they supportive of this program or not supportive?
In Saudi Arabia, there's you can see that it comes in waves where there's criticism of the Saudi program. Usually, every 4 or 6 months, there are a series of commentaries, not bad, saying, we spend all this money and my son hasn't done anything wrong. How come he didn't get a new car? And I think there's also, in addition to within the general population, also within the interior ministry, there's the opinion. Some people, I think, would argue that if we took 50 of these guys out and executed them today, it would send a much stronger message of the state's resolve to fight extremism.
Following up on what Thomas Heckhammer said.
the government has a new communications strategy, and I don't want to put words in Thomas's mouth, but I think it's that the government is in control of the situation and is able to say that instead of having the QAP dictating the pace of communications that the government is. And you see a lot of these guys are fundraisers and recruiters and internet propagandists. Yeah, I think the reason I think why some of the data is so, it looks so incredible with the Saudi program is that on the range of offenders, these are the easiest guys who go through and get out. These are the guys who get caught with propaganda or other stuff.
In back.
Hi, I'm Colin Soloway. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the distinctions between, or actually perhaps a disagreement that you had. Peter, you were suggesting that the amnesty program in Afghanistan might be usefully applied in Pakistan. But Mr. Baumann, I think you had said that the sort of, at least the Saudi-style de-radicalization program wouldn't work in Afghanistan at the moment. And I was just wondering if you could discuss maybe the differences in programs or in Afghanistan, the difference of the situation of the insurgents, of the people taking the amnesty there, the situation of the security situation, how that contributes to that in Pakistan as far as people's ability to go home and be, quote, rehabilitated, social background, because they are both, certainly the Pashtun areas are all tribal areas, tribal societies, but there seem to be a lot of differences. I wonder if you could discuss them.
I think the biggest difference, is that Afghanistan is a very weak state, and so is Pakistan a very weak state, and Saudi Arabia is a very strong state. That's the difference. It's just, and also, of course, these programs aren't happening in Afghanistan or in Pakistan yet. And this is really, I think, one of the takeaways of this panel is that the countries which are having success need to really bring the Pakistanis and also the Afghans and show them best practices.
I would just add, as the panel pointed out on Pakistan earlier, for years the Pakistani government has actually supported the radicals and militants. So now they have to come to the point of view that these people are their enemies before they can start a de-radicalization program.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. But I think Ken has sort of nailed it. A lot of these people were government assets, so how do you then give them amnesty for things that they were actually doing for the government? Anyway, I think we'd like to thank our panelists for a really great set of presentations.
And as I feel like I'm always doing, thank Peter Bergen. This is fun when you feel like you've gone through a conference all day and you get to